Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was one of those fog-laced mornings in London when the city seemed to turn inward, cloaking its secrets behind a curtain of drifting grey. The streets glistened with moisture from an overnight drizzle, and Baker Street, ever resilient to weather or time, had taken on the muffled quiet of an early hour, untouched by urgency. I had just returned from my morning walk, an unambitious circuit to the corner tobacconist, and back when I found Holmes seated, in his customary posture, cross-legged on the tips of his fingers pressed together, eyes half closed, and the faintest tendril of smoke curling from the bowl of his meerschaum pipe. He did not look up as I entered, but offered the softest murmur of acknowledgement. "Watson," he said, "how punctual the fog is! It arrives like a Swiss train, indifferent, exacting, and inevitably on time." I made some mumbled agreement and settled into my chair with the newspaper, intending no more than a peaceful hour of idle reading. I had not turned past the second page when the sound of brisk footsteps echoed up the stairwell. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson knocked, then entered with a troubled expression. "There's a gentleman here to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it's a matter of urgency and he's come from Sussex." Holmes opened one eye. "Send him in, if you please, Mrs. Hudson." Our visitor entered hastily. A tall man of perhaps 50, with frost on his overcoat and a frantic manner about the eyes. His dark, travel-stained clothing bore traces of the rural road, and his mustache twitched nervously above lips pressed thin with worry. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "I am, and this is my friend and chronicler, Dr. Watson." The man bowed briefly, then took the chair Holmes gestured toward. "My name is James Chilton. I'm the steward of Westvale Hall, a manor near Eastbourne. I've come about a murder, Mr. Holmes, a murder that by every physical law ought not to have been possible." Holmes sat forward, pipe removed, interest piqued. "Go on, Mr. Chilton." The man swallowed, nodding. "The victim is Miss Harriet Vine. She was found dead in the drawing-room yesterday morning, alone, locked from the inside. The windows were all latched, the chimney flue closed, and there was not a mark upon her He hesitated, as if the very memory strained credibility. "Except what?" Holmes pressed gently. "She had a single hairpin silver common driven directly into the base of her skull. No blood, no bruising, nothing was disturbed in the room, and most oddly, most impossibly, there was a circle traced around her body. A perfect circle, on the rug, not drawn in chalk or ink, mind you. It was as if the fibers themselves had been flattened precisely in that shape. Yet no object in the room could have done it." I leaned forward, incredulous. Was it a trick of light, or perhaps a draught? "There was no draught," Chilton cut in, "and the drawing-room was utterly untouched. No sign of forced entry. Miss Vine was alone when she retired the night before. The only key to the room was still in the lock on the inside." Holmes rose, moving to the window with a distant expression, then turned. "Tell me of the household." "Sir Lawrence Vine, Miss Harriet's brother, owns the estate, widower, a man of private means. There are 3 other individuals presently at the Hall: Lady Agnes Moncrief, a cousin and ward of Sir Lawrence; Miss Clara Linton, a distant relative who arrived for a short stay 3 days ago; and Mr. Frederick Daines, Sir Lawrence's personal secretary. The staff consists of a butler, a cook, and 2 maids." Holmes's fingers drummed the window-pane, and no one heard anything. No screams, no footsteps, nothing. Chilton's voice dropped. "The doctor said the hairpin pierced the brainstem with unnatural precision, as if placed by a surgeon. But Miss Vine had no known enemies, and there is no sign anyone even entered the room." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I believe our foggy morning has just acquired a glint of sunshine. This promises to be delightfully irrational." He looked again to Chilton. "You say this occurred yesterday?" "Yes, sir." "Then with haste, we can reach Eastbourne by evening." Chilton exhaled in relief. I've arranged for a private coach to Victoria Station, should you agree to come." Holmes nodded. "Pack lightly, Watson. We are bound for a house where murder walks without leaving a footprint, and a hairpin draws circles that geometry itself cannot explain." As I fetched my coat and notebook, I could not shake the chill that settled in my bones. Not from the fog, but from the haunting image that now formed in my mind. A lifeless body, a locked room, a single, sharp hairpin, and a silent, impossible circle. Chapter 2. The case unfolds at Baker Street. The rattle of the train as it departed Victoria Station was rhythmic and dull, like the beating of a slow and contemplative heart. Across from me, in the plush compartment, Holmes sat in an attitude of profound abstraction, his steepled fingers pressed lightly against his chin, eyes fixed upon some distant point that only his mind could see. James Chilton, the steward, sat to Holmes' right, nervously wringing his gloved hands, his hat forgotten in his lap. Though he had now related the strange events at Westvale Hall twice once in our sitting room and again on the cab ride to the station, Holmes had offered no reaction beyond a murmur or the occasional narrowing of his eyes. I, however, remained deeply unsettled. A murder with no visible entry or exit, a hairpin as the weapon, and a circle perfect, deliberate left behind as the only sign of presence. It strained belief and teased the imagination. Holmes broke his silence abruptly. "You mentioned, Mr. Chilton, that Miss Vine was found with a silver hairpin embedded at the base of her skull. Were there any signs of struggle?" "None whatsoever," Chilton replied. "Her expression was peaceful, almost composed. She was seated in the armchair near the fireplace, as though she had simply nodded off. The pin was lodged so deeply the physician thought it had been driven by a blow, but there was no bruising, no force apparent. And this physician, who is he?" "Dr. Isaac Morley, a countryman, but competent and long in service to the estate." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the circle, describe it again." "It was perhaps 5 feet across, a perfect ring traced into the carpet pile around the chair. You could see it clearly in the morning light. Not burned, not drawn, just pressed. Could a cord or weight have been dragged to make such an impression?" "No cord was found, nor any object that could have been used so precisely." Holmes closed his eyes for a moment. Then, to my surprise, he shifted in his seat and reached into his coat pocket, producing the day's Daily Telegraph, folded neatly to the crossword. "Watson, would you be so good as to time me?" "Time you? I wish to see if I can complete it in fewer than 7 minutes." "Begin now." Though somewhat baffled, I withdrew my pocket watch and complied. Holmes took up a pencil and worked in silence, his movements swift, spare, and without correction. Mr. Chilton cast a glance at me, clearly unsure whether the famed detective had gone mad or merely was indifferent to the gravity of the case. After precisely 6 minutes and 39 seconds, Holmes set down the paper. "There," he said, "all done." "Holmes, surely this is not the time." "On the contrary," he replied calmly, "it is precisely the time. One must occasionally exercise the mind on ordinary diversions before it begins to perceive the extraordinary. The human intellect, Watson, is much like a lens. It must be finely adjusted before the faintest outline comes into view." He turned to Chilton. "Forgive me, but now I am ready to consider your case in full." Chilton, who had been twisting his gloves like a penitent at a confessional, leaned forward. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I know how strange it all must sound." Holmes gave him a small smile. "Strangeness is my natural habitat, Mr. Chilton. Now, let us consider motive. Miss Vine, what kind of woman was she?" "Quiet, reserved. She was known for her embroidery, long walks, and reading. Not the sort to provoke hatred or conflict. Any romantic entanglements?" Chilton hesitated. "There were whispers of an attachment some years ago, but it never amounted to anything. She lived in the hall with her brother, and since the death of Sir Lawrence's wife, she took on many of the social duties. Money. She had a modest inheritance from an aunt, comfortable, but not large. Upon her death, it reverts to her brother." Holmes nodded. "That alone suggests nothing nefarious. And the other guests, Lady Agnes, Miss Linton, Mr. Danes, what of them?" "Lady Agnes is rather shy and deeply religious. She spends most of her time with her piano or her prayer book. Miss Linton is energetic, fond of conversation, and perhaps a touch dramatic." Holmes smiled faintly. "Dramatic? She has an interest in spiritualism, seances, that sort of thing. She arrived just a few days ago." "Ah, as for Mr. Danesy, is Sir Lawrence's secretary, and very precise." a bachelor, quiet, and keeps to himself. Holmes steepled his fingers again. All respectable, all suspicious. You understand, Mr. Chilton, that this case will hinge not on what is obvious, but on what is intentionally obscured. Locked rooms are not puzzles without answers. They are traps laid for the incautious thinker. He glanced at me. You recall, Watson, the affair of the Belladonna letters. Certainly there, too, the locked room concealed no magic-only misdirection, but the circle that is new. It suggests not merely secrecy, but performance. Someone meant that symbol to be seen. Chilton's brow furrowed. But for what purpose? That, Holmes said softly, is what we must discover. The train lurched as we passed through a tunnel, and for a moment we sat in shadow. I stared out the window at the vague outline of hills forming beyond the grey, and a single thought echoed in my mind. We were travelling not toward answers, but into the very heart of a riddle, one where death had left no door open, and reason itself would be tested. Chapter 3. The Scene of Deception. Sun was descending behind a curtain of ash-grey clouds by the time we arrived at Westvale Hall. The estate stood on a bluff above the Eastbourne cliffs, surrounded by bare trees and winter grass, its stone facade cloaked in ivy that had long since lost its green. A solemn wind blew from the sea, rustling through brittle hedgerows like the whisper of unseen watchers. Mr. Chilton led us through the iron gate and up a path lined with gravel and frost-bitten shrubbery. The front door, a wide oak affair with a lion-headed knocker, was opened by a liveried butler, whose age seemed to rival the manor itself. His expression showed neither surprise nor curiosity, only the weary resignation of a man who had served long under roof and ritual. "This way, gentlemen," Chilton said. "We've left the drawing-room untouched, as you requested by telegram." Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes already scanning the hall's interior. The place smelled faintly of beeswax, coal smoke, and lavender. It was richly furnished, but not ostentatious, the house of an old family. Long past the need for show, the drawing-room lay at the end of a short corridor panelled in dark walnut. Chilton paused outside the door and lowered his voice. "This is where Miss Vine was found yesterday morning. No one has entered since, save for the constable and the doctor, both of whom wore gloves and disturbed as little as possible." Holmes drew a breath and slowly opened the door. The room was dim, the curtains drawn partway across the tall windows, admitting the dying daylight in slanted, copper-colored beams. A heavy carpet in deep burgundy covered the floor, and on it sat an armchair of green velvet, her-backed and worn at the arms. The hearth stood cold and empty, its grate dusted with fine ash, but all else faded as I saw it. The circle, a perfect ring, surrounded the chair, not drawn in chalk, not carved, but made by the subtle flattening of the carpet's pile. It was no more than half an inch wide, yet it gleamed faintly in the light, like a halo on cloth. The armchair sat precisely at the center. In that chair, I imagined the lifeless form of Miss Harriet Vine, seated as though in quiet thought until some unseen hand ended her life with a tool meant for the dressing table. Holmes moved not toward the chair, but to the threshold, where he paused. He removed his gloves and produced a small magnifying glass, his gaze sweeping the doorframe, the handle, and then the floor beneath. "No scuff marks," he murmured. "No drag lines. The carpet's pile near the door is undisturbed. Miss Vine was found seated here." He asked Chilton. "Yes, as you see it now." Dr. Morley removed only the pin, which he's placed in a sealed case. Holmes turned his gaze back to the circle. He walked its circumference with slow, deliberate steps, never once stepping within it. He crouched beside it and ran his hand just above the surface, fingers tracing invisible lines in the air. "Curious," he said softly. "The compression is uniform, yet no instrument lies nearby that could have created such precision. The pile is not burned, not cut, simply pressed." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small vial and brush, delicately dusting the edge of the circle with white powder. Nothing emerged. No residue, no particles, only the faint print of the powder against the fabric. "Watson," he said, rising, "what do you observe about the chair?" I looked at it again. It seems ordinary, worn, comfortable, perhaps. Slight sag in the seat cushion. The left arm has more wear than the right. She may have leaned that way when seated. "Indeed," he said, "and the footstool." There was a small one, partially under the chair, made of the same green velvet. She may have used it while reading. Note its position, partially tucked under the seat, suggesting it was moved back as someone sat. He turned sharply. And yet where are the I frowned. Indentations. Holmes pointed at the carpet beneath the stool. Were Miss Vine seated with her feet upon it, the pressure would have left a mark. But the pile is level, untouched. The stool is near but not engaged. I approached, heart beginning to race. So she may not have been seated voluntarily, or not at all, Holmes said, his voice low. We must not assume that what appears simple is so. Now observe the fireplace. He moved swiftly to the grate and inspected the ashes, then turned toward the mantel. On it sat a brass clock, 2 silver candlesticks, and a small porcelain figurine of a Sephird harm. Holmes studied them in silence, then looked down. He picked up a scrap of paper from the edge of the hearth. It was charred, brittle. The remains of a letter, I asked. No ink remains. But the quality of the paper vellum suggests correspondence of significance. He replaced the scrap and turned to Chilton, who discovered the body. The housemaid, Bethany. She brings tea at 7:30. She knocked, received no answer, and found the door locked. It was forced by the butler. Sir Lawrence was informed immediately. Holmes gave a short nod. I shall wish to speak with them all. But first, one last question. Where is the hairpin? In the study. I'll fetch it at once. As Chilton left, Holmes crouched again by the chair. Then, without warning, reached into the cushioned seam and extracted something small and glinting. A pin, he murmured, but not silver. This one is bronze. He handed it to me in silence. I examined it. It was dull, worn, and slightly bent, as if from long use. A decoy? I asked. No, he said, eyes narrowing. A message. Before I could ask more, Chilton returned with a small case. Inside lay the silver hairpin, its tip faintly tinged with something dark. Holmes looked at it, but said nothing. Instead, he stood, arms behind his back, and surveyed the room once more. The scene is clever, Watson, he said softly. Too clever, I swallowed. What do you mean? I mean, he replied, that someone staged this, not only the death but the impossibility. And with that, he turned from the room, leaving the circle untouched, and my thoughts more entangled than ever. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. We retired from the drawing-room in silence, Holmes trailing behind Mr. Chilton with that peculiar light in his eyes that I had come to associate with cases that both vexed and fascinated him. We were led into the morning-room, a smaller chamber lined with floral wallpaper and overburdened bookcases. A coal fire crackled in the hearth, and the windows let in the last pale blush of twilight. Lady Agnes, Miss Linton, and Mr. Daines are waiting for you here, Chilton said softly. Sir Lawrence is upstairs with the doctor. He is ... unwell. Holmes gave a short nod. Understandable. We shall speak with him later. For now, let us begin. 3 figures sat within the room, their expressions ranging from cool reserve to strained civility. Each rose at our entrance. Lady Agnes Moncrief was the first to meet us. She was no more than 23, with dark, serious eyes and a narrow face that bore an almost monastic solemnity. Her hands were clasped before her, pale and motionless. A crucifix of jet and silver hung at her throat. Beside her stood Miss Clara Lintner, striking contrast. Young, auburn-haired, and animated in bearing, she had the theatrical air of someone used to company and eager to perform for it. She watched Holmes with evident curiosity. The third was Mr. Frederick Daines, a man of perhaps 35, with sharp features and spectacles that seemed too small for his angular face. His suit was immaculate, his bearing formal, but his gaze held something distant, calculating perhaps, or merely careful. Holmes inclined his head. I thank you for your time. I am Mr. Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. John Watson. I regret that our meeting comes under such grievous circumstances. Lady Agnes nodded gravely. We are still in shock, Mr. Holmes. Harriet was like a sister to me. Miss Linton gave a soft, almost theatrical sigh. It's been simply ghastly. Mr. Daines offered no greeting, only a silent nod. Holmes took a seat by the hearth and steepled his fingers. I knew this posture. Well, it signaled the beginning of his method. Passive, almost languid observation that would later, I knew, yield remarkable results. May I begin, Holmes said, by asking each of you to describe your last contact with Miss Vine on the evening before her death. Lady Agnes spoke first, her voice low and even. I left her in the drawing-room around 9:30. We had tea together, as we often did. She was reading. I remember because I remarked upon the fire being low, and she said she preferred it that way in the evenings. Did she seem distressed, anxious? No, in fact, she seemed unusually at peace. Holmes turned. Miss Linton, I saw her only briefly, she said, brushing a curl from her cheek. I'd just come down from my room and stopped in to say good night. I was feeling unsettled that evening. I had a frightful headache and had taken some laudanum. She smiled and told me to rest. And Mr. Daines, the secretary, cleared his throat. I passed her in the corridor. She mentioned something about posting a letter. I assumed she meant the household box. We have a small one near the servants' entrance. But I did not see her again. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly. Do you know if the letter was found? Daines shook his head. I'm afraid I wouldn't know. Holmes stood and moved slowly to the window. He looked out for a long moment, then spoke again. Was Miss Vine in the habit of locking the drawing-room door? Lady Agnes answered. Yes, she often did in the evenings. She found comfort in solitude, and the room has a bolt from the inside. Did she admit anyone that night after you left? I cannot say. I retired not long after. Holmes turned, his gaze settling on Miss Linton. You mentioned laudanum. Is it a regular remedy for you? She blinked. Why, yes. I have a history of ... nerves. London physicians prescribe it often. It calms the thoughts. And where were you between 10 and midnight? In my room. I read briefly, then fell asleep. Alone. She bristled slightly. Of course. Holmes moved on. And you, Mr. Daines? I was in the library, preparing the week's correspondence for Sir Lawrence. Did anyone see you? No. But the household log will show the lamp was lit well past midnight. Holmes nodded. Then his eyes flicked to the crucifix at Lady Agnes's neck. You are devout, Lady Agnes. Deeply. Do you believe in symbols, signs? She hesitated. Of course, the Lord sends us signs every day, if we are quiet enough to perceive them. Holmes smiled faintly. And yet a perfect circle around a lifeless woman. No one has yet claimed to understand it. Lady Agnes crossed herself. I thought it blasphemous, a mockery, almost pagan. Miss Linton interjected. Or spiritual. Circles protect, don't they? In some traditions at least. Harriet would never have drawn one herself. But perhaps someone else thought she needed guarding. From what? Holmes asked, and for a moment, none answered. He moved back to the fireplace and picked up the poker. Gently, he stirred the embers, though the fire had already settled into coals. There is something curious in this household, he said. Each of you describes a quiet, serene evening. No disturbance, no raised voice. And yet, somewhere between 9:30 and dawn, a woman was murdered with surgical precision and left framed by an impossible symbol. He paused. I do not believe in accidents, and I most certainly do not believe in ghosts. He turned to Chilton. Have the staff assemble tomorrow morning in the breakfast room. I shall need a word with each of them. In the meantime, no one is to leave the estate. A silence followed his words, taut as a wire. Then Holmes added, Dr. Watson and I will retire. We have much to consider before the morning. We left the room with footsteps echoing down the corridor, and as we ascended to our quarters, I glanced back once. Miss Linton was still watching us, one hand at her mouth, the other gripping her skirts. And Mr. Daines was not watching at all. Chapter 5. First suspects, the red herring. Following morning broke with a brittle chill that crept into the eaves and lingered in the corridors of Westvale Hall. Frost patterned the windows in delicate ferns, and somewhere beyond the hedges, a rook cawed hoarsely into the silence. Holmes and I descended to the breakfast room at precisely 8 o'clock to find Inspector Henry Larch seated at the long walnut table, thumbing through a small notebook with bureaucratic concentration, a man of middling years with a robust moustache and an air of perpetual irritation. Larch had been sent from the local station to oversee the case. However, it was clear from his expression that he viewed Holmes' arrival as both a relief and a complication. Mr. Holmes, he said, rising, Dr. Watson, you'll forgive me for starting early. I've taken initial statements from the servants. Bit of a shock to the household, as you'd expect. Holmes inclined his head. And have you formed a theory? Larch gave a dry cough. Well, there's something that smells off about the secretary, Mr. Daines. Quiet type. Too quiet, if you take my meaning. He had access to the study where the hairpin was kept, and was unaccounted for during the critical hours. Motives thin, I admit, but perhaps Miss Vine knew something. Secrets, Mr. Holmes, can turn the most respectable man into a murderer. Holmes seated himself near the fire, fingers steepled, his eyes half closed in thought. I recognized his silence not as agreement but as internal protest. He was not fond of premature conclusions, especially ones offered on a platter of vague suspicion. "What of Miss Linton?" Holmes asked, without opening his eyes. "She claims to have been under the effects of laudanum." "Ah, well," Larch muttered, flipping a page. "That one's a bit dramatic. Talks in riddles. Seems more interested in how the case will be remembered than who did it. No solid evidence against her, but I wouldn't call her reliable. And Lady Agnes, devout and dull," Larch said simply, "was seen reading in the parlour most of the evening. No sign of deceit, at least on the surface." Holmes opened his eyes, and the staff, Larch shrugged, all accounted for. "The maid who found the body is still shaken. The butler's older than the carpet, and twice as stiff. Cook and the other girl were asleep downstairs. No one saw or heard a thing." Holmes stood abruptly. "Come, Watson, let us speak with Mr. Daines. I find convenient suspicions the most suspicious of all." We found Frederick Daines in the small study overlooking the south lawn. He was sorting through a pile of letters with meticulous care, his ink blotter aligned with military precision. He rose when we entered, his eyes as unreadable as before. "You've spoken with Inspector Lund?" Holmes asked. "I have. He asked me what he thought proper, and I answered in kind." "Then let us presume honesty, and begin again. I should like to know what Miss Vine may have intended to do with the letter she mentioned." Daines set down the envelope he held. "I'm afraid I cannot say. She handled her own correspondence. She was not the sort to confide in others. Not in me. I am not a confidante. I am a functionary." Holmes tilted his head. "Yet she trusted you enough to mention the letter." Daines hesitated. "Perhaps she did not mean to. It was a passing comment." Holmes took a slow step around the desk, letting his fingers trail along its edge. "Tell me, Mr. Daines, have you ever observed Miss Vine in distress? Any quarrels with the other guests?" Daines' voice was even. "She was the very soul of calm. I have never known her to raise her voice." Holmes paused by a side cabinet. "And yet she met a violent end, in a room sealed from within, with a hairpin placed through a precise and fatal point. That is not the end of a woman who lived without conflict. That is the end of someone whose silence concealed something worth killing for." Daines' jaw tightened, though his expression did not change. "I cannot speak to that. But I assure you, Mr. Holmes, if I knew anything that might help, I would tell you." Holmes turned to leave, then paused. "Have you ever read much geometry, Mr. Daines?" Daines blinked. "Geometry, yes. Circles, in particular. They fascinate me. They are the only shape without beginning or end. And yet we rely on them for boundaries, clocks, locks, even halos." Daines regarded him coolly. "I studied mathematics at Cambridge, if that's what you mean." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then you will appreciate the beauty of a problem that rests on symmetry. And what happens when something breaks it?" We left him then, walking in silence down the corridor. Holmes did not speak again until we had returned to the morning room. "There is a calm in Mr. Daines that does not sit easily with me, Watson," he said. "It is not the calm of innocence, nor that of guilt, but the calm of someone who is waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For us to draw the wrong conclusion." I frowned. "Then you believe he's innocent?" "I believe," Holmes said, settling into the chair, "that he is not the murderer, but he knows more than he dares to say, and therein lies the danger." He tapped a finger against his knee. "As for Inspector Larch, he is chasing a red herring. Daines may hold secrets, but not the kind that kill." A knock interrupted our thoughts. Chiltern entered, holding a slip of paper. This was found in the heart of Lady Annis's sitting room. Sir Holmes took it. The paper was half burnt, but bore a single visible line. "No more circles, no more locks. It ends tonight." Holmes looked up, eyes gleaming. "Ah," he whispered. "Now we begin to speak the language of murder." Chapter 6. The burnt message. The note found in Lady Annis's hearth was placed upon the morning room table, and for a full minute Holmes said nothing. He stared at the half-burned scrap, as though its ashes might whisper truths only he could hear. The fire crackled quietly in the grate behind us, as if mocking the ruin left by another blaze. I leaned over his shoulder and read again the solitary lines still visible. "No more circles, no more locks. It ends tonight." Holmes tapped the corner of the paper. "The handwriting is a match for Miss Vine's, albeit hurried and slanted. The ink has bled slightly, indicating that it was damp, possibly even written in haste just before the destruction. The message, though cryptic, is damning. But what could it mean?" I asked. "No more circles, no more locks. Symbols," Holmes murmured, of confinement, secrecy, and endless repetition. The hairpin that drew a circle, the locked study. Perhaps she grew tired of the endless dance, the concealed pattern. She meant to break it, and someone ensured she would not. I was about to respond when the door opened and Miss Eloise Linton entered. Her dark eyes, wide and restless, scanned the room before she spoke. "I was told you'd found something." Holmes stood, offering a small, neutral bow. "Indeed, a portion of what appears to be a farewell, or an intent to act written, perhaps, by Miss Vine. Do you recognize the phrasing?" She stepped forward and glanced at the paper, her brows knit in concern. "She used to say that," she murmured. "No more circles." I heard her whisper it once after one of her migraines. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Do you know what it referred to?" Eloise hesitated, clearly caught between instinct and discretion. I think she felt trapped by something, a pattern she couldn't escape, something from her past. She nodded slowly. "Something old, something she never named. She wore that hairpin always, even when alone. I asked her once if it was a gift. She said no. She said it was a reminder of what. She never said, only that it had been earned in silence. I thought it was poetic nonsense at the time." Holmes turned toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "People do not wear symbols for beauty alone, Miss Linton. They wear them to hold close the truth they cannot speak aloud." She looked at him uncertainly. "Do you think the hairpin was the weapon?" Holmes did not turn. "I believe it was the message." She left not long after, visibly disturbed. Holmes returned to the note and stared at it again in silence. "Watson," he said at last, "we must visit Lady Agnes. I believe she may know more than she pretends. A message burned in her heart cannot be mere coincidence." We made our way through the long hallway to the drawing room, where Lady Agnes sat alone in a wing-backed chair, a prayer book open on her lap. She looked up as we entered, her lined face unreadable. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. Dr. Holmes bowed slightly. "Lady Agnes, I must ask you a direct question. Did you burn this?" He held out the slip of scorched paper. Her eyes did not widen in surprise, but neither did they show recognition. "I did not," she replied softly, "but it was found in your hearth." Her hands, pale and dry, closed the book with care. "Then someone placed it there. I've not lit that fire since yesterday morning." Holmes studied her closely. "You do not deny that Miss Vine confided in you?" "She did not confide in anyone," Lady Agnes said. She was composed, guarded. Her emotions ran inwards, not out. "But I will tell you this. 2 nights ago, I passed her in the hall. She looked frightened, more than I have ever seen her. I asked if she was ill. She shook her head and said, 'Not ill. Just waiting for the circle to break.' Then she vanished into her room." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did she say what she meant?" "She said nothing more to me. But she asked me if I believed people could disappear from the world, even while standing in plain sight. I thought it was a philosophical musing." "No, Lady Agnes," Holmes said quietly. "It was a warning." When we returned to the morning room, a footman was waiting. "Beg pardon, sir," he said. "The gardener's boy found something by the back hedge. Looks like it might be Miss Vine's." A brooch. Holmes took the object from the boy's gloved hand. It was a thin gold brooch, shaped like a circle with a line cut cleanly through the center, a circle broken. A jagged crack ran across its surface, and the clasp was missing. Holmes turned it over and found a single initial carved faintly on the underside. "F this," he said, "was not left by accident. You'd think someone planted it." I asked. "No," Holmes replied. "I think she dropped it intentionally. A sign, a final trace." He fell silent, brooding. The morning was drawing toward noon, but the house seemed suspended in a strange, muffled dread. No one moved with purpose. Whispers curled through the halls like mist. At last Holmes rose. "Watson," he said, "there is a design to this too precise to be chaos. Miss Vine left us clues, but to see the whole, we must return to the place where the circle began. The study." He nodded. "Yes, and this time we shall examine it not as the scene of a crime, but as a message left mid-sentence." Chapter 7. The geometry of death. Holmes stood at the threshold of the study, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished floor. The mid-morning sun angled through the narrow windows, painting pale gold patterns on the parquet. The air inside was stale with the scent of old paper and beeswax, yet still tinged with something more elusive and unease, as if the room itself recoiled from what had taken place within it. "Do you see, Watson?" Holmes asked, eyes scanning the room with a renewed hunger. I followed his gaze. but to my eye the room remained much as we had left it. Bookshelves lining the walls, a mahogany writing desk near the window, the faint outline where Miss Vine's body had lain now marked with chalk and absence. I see a room tidied after tragedy, I said, but no more than that. Holmes stepped inside and gestured toward the desk. Not the room, the shape. Watson, look closely. The desk is positioned so that the chair is enclosed on 3 sides. The bookshelves are curved. Even the carpet, if you observe, bears a floral pattern looping continuously. I frowned. It's hardly uncommon for a study to be arranged circularly. It promotes ease of access. Precisely, Holmes said. Ease of access, or in Miss Vine's case, no escape. She was encircled, quite literally and symbolically. The room is a prison masquerading as comfort. He crouched near the bookshelf on the far side of the study and ran a gloved finger along the inside edge. Then, with a flick, he pressed a wooden knob between 2 volumes. A small panel opened with a soft creak. I blinked. Good heavens, a secret compartment. Holmes reached inside and pulled out a stack of old papers tied with a blue ribbon. He untied them swiftly, and we both leaned in as he turned the brittle pages. These, he said, are letters, all addressed to a single name, F. I stiffened. The same initial carved on the brooch. Indeed, he read aloud from the topmost sheet, his voice steady despite the rising tension. You left me in silence, but I hear you still. Every room echoes with your name. Every night, I count the steps around my thoughts, hoping they will break. But the circle never ends. You promised me it would. You lied. He looked up. These are not casual notes, Watson. They are confessions, laments, possibly even threats. And yet they were hidden. Then whoever F is, I said. Miss Vine was writing to her about them until the very end, or beyond it, Holmes murmured. We leafed through more of the letters. Some were barely legible, others torn or smeared, yet one word appeared again and again. Circle, sometimes capitalized, sometimes underlined, sometimes alone on the page. There's something ritualistic in her repetition, Holmes said, not mere metaphor. At that moment, the door creaked, and a figure lingered at the frame. Mr. Godfrey Vine, the father. His stern face wore the deep frown of disapproval. I was told you had returned to the study, he said curtly. Have you found anything? Holmes did not offer him the letters. Instead, he closed the compartment and stood. Tell me, Mr. Vine, did your daughter have a suitor, one whose name began with F? Godfrey's eyes narrowed. She did not. You seem quite certain. My daughter was peculiar, prone to melancholia. She often lived inside her own world. She was not the sort to form attachments easily, and yet she wrote passionately to someone she called F. She described betrayal, silence, circles she could not break. A flicker crossed the man's face, something between irritation and regret. Then it was a fantasy. Agnes always indulged her ramblings. Holmes stepped closer. Was she kept here against her will? Godfrey's expression hardened. No. She was ill, not imprisoned. You locked the study door the night of her death, to protect her, or to keep others out. There was a pause. Then the man's tone turned cold. Mr. Holmes, I allowed you here out of courtesy. If you are going to insinuate cruelty where there was none, I insinuate nothing, Holmes interrupted. But I do follow facts, and the facts suggest Miss Vine felt watched, confined, and silenced. Whether by illness or interference, I shall uncover the cause. Godfrey gave him a long, smouldering look before turning on his heel and leaving without another word. Holmes waited until the door had shut before turning to me. That man, he said, knows far more than he admits. There is guilt behind his composure, and not only grief. I nodded. But if he didn't kill her, then he was complicit in keeping her secret. Holmes returned to the letters and pocketed one, the most coherent among them. We must now consult someone who understood her in ways no guardian ever could. Eloise Linton again. Yes, but more importantly, the maid, Marjorie. The maid, who washes a woman's hair, sees more of her soul than most priests, and I suspect Marjorie saw something she has yet to reveal. Chapter 8. The maid. At the mirror, Marjorie Chooks sat ramrod straight on the edge of a stiff velvet armchair in the parlor, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if suppressing their natural tendency to tremble. Her uniform, though immaculately ironed, hung loose on her wiry frame, and her eyes bore the red rim of someone who had wept often and in silence. Holmes gave her a courteous nod. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us again, Miss Chooks. Marjorie looked between Holmes and me, lips pressed together, If it's more questions about Miss Agnes, I'll do what I can, she said in a quiet voice. But I told the constable everything I knew. Holmes sat opposite her and leaned forward just slightly. Often it is what one does not say that proves most revealing. A silence followed. The clock ticked in the corner. Marjorie exhaled through her nose. I didn't keep nothing from them on purpose, sir. I swear it. Only, I didn't think half of it mattered. Even a circle begins with a point, Holmes said gently. He told Inspector Stroud that Miss Vine had been increasingly withdrawn in the weeks before her death. Yes, sir. She'd taken to pacing the halls in the night. Wouldn't eat unless you reminded her twice. The master said it was her nerves again. But I don't think it was just that. No. I asked, what then? She was frightened. Marjorie whispered, properly frightened. Not of something outside, but of something inside her thoughts. Or maybe this house. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Why the house? She would stare at the walls, Marjorie said, voice tightening, trace shapes on them with her fingers, sometimes whispering words. Circles, mostly. The circle never ends, she'd mutter. Once, I asked what she meant, and she snapped at me so unlike her. Said I shouldn't speak it aloud, that it invited it back. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. You said it. What did she think she was inviting back? Holmes asked. Marjorie hesitated. That's just I don't know. But there was one evening, a week before she passed. She had one of her spells. Worse than usual. She was in her room, sitting before the mirror, just brushing and brushing her hair. She wouldn't stop the mirror. Holmes leaned in slightly. Was there anything peculiar about it? She was staring into it like it might answer her. Marjorie replied. And then she said, clear as day, tell me how the circle ends. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. She turned to me. Marjorie continued, and said, I think it wants me to end it. Then she burst into tears and wouldn't speak another word the whole night. Holmes tapped his finger on the armrest. You were close to her, weren't you? I raised her from when she was little, the maid said, a sudden intensity in her tone. Her mother died young. The master's never been the same since. He made her a secret, not a daughter, locked her away in this house, and told everyone it was for her good. And did she have visitors? Only Miss Linton, now and then, and that stopped after Easter. The master said they quarrelled, but Agnes was never the same after. Did you ever hear her mention someone with a name beginning in F? Holmes asked. Marjorie's brow furrowed. No, I don't think so. Wait, she did have a book-old leather thing she kept hidden behind her dressing table. It had F carved into the inside cover. Holmes straightened. May I see it? I don't know if the constable took it. I can check. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a small, worn book clutched in her hand. Holmes took it delicately and opened to the first page. French, he murmured. Rambo, Uni Saison and Enfer. A Season in Hell. That was the one, Marjorie said. She kept it close. Used to underline verses now and then, mostly the ones that made no sense to me. Holmes flipped through pages inked with faint lines and occasional notes. One margin held a short phrase in Miss Vine's neat hand, where the circle breaks. The truth returns. What did she think she was trapped in? I asked quietly. Holmes closed the book. I believe Miss Vine was haunted. Yes, but not by phantoms, rather by memory. A cycle repeated too long, locked away by family, by shame, and she knew something she could not bear. Marjorie nodded faintly, her eyes filling again. I always knew she was stronger than they thought, she whispered. But she never stood a chance. She may yet find her voice, Holmes said gently, if we can listen closely enough. We rose, and as Holmes tucked the book into his coat, he turned once more to the maid. One final question, he said. Did Miss Vine ever mention a brooch with a carving on the back? Marjorie blinked. Yes, silver, with little curls around the stone. She said it used to be her mother's. She wore it the day before. That day, Holmes's voice was low. Was it on her when they found her? No, she replied. It was gone. Chapter 9. A Season in Health. Clouds hung low over Hadfield Grange as we stepped outside once more. The air dense with the fragrance of damp hedgerows and something older, sadder feeling of memories mired in soil. Holmes walked slowly along the gravel path, his hands clasped behind his back, the worn French volume tucked beneath one arm like a sacred text. I followed, still haunted by the words the maid had spoken. She said it wanted her to end the circle, I murmured, half to myself. Holmes nodded, not breaking stride. The choice of metaphor is not accidental. Miss Vine was a woman imprisoned by more than solitude or illness. She was ensnared in a cycle, the geometry of the soul, if you will. We passed a clump of lavender growing wild against the stone wall, bees dancing through it. She called the brooch her mother's. I said, yet it was gone, taken before or after she died. Indeed, a missing brooch may be small in the eyes of the law, but to a careful observer it is akin to a thread left dangling from the hem of a cloak. Pull it, and the whole garment may unravel. We arrived once again at the greenhouse, its windows weeping condensation, the glass catching the grey light like a weary eye. Holmes did not enter this time. Instead, he paused and took the leather-bound book from beneath his coat, flipping it open to a marked page. I leaned closer. She underlined this verse twice. He said, "Listen, J tendu de cords, de clocker, de girlands de fenoter, de chains d'or de toil, oil, etched, donks. I have stretched ropes from steeple to steeple, garlands from window to window, chains of gold from star to star, and I dance." He looked at me. A dance across invisible bridges perhaps, even lines of secrecy and loss. Rambo wrote this during a period of madness and transformation. It is a fitting companion for a woman on the brink of some personal abyss. You think Agnes saw herself in the poem. I think she saw in it what others could not express aloud. He turned another page, where a small dried flower had been pressed brittle now, brown with age. Primrose, Holmes said, a symbol of youth, and of first love. He closed the book and gestured for us to walk on. "We must visit Miss Linton," he said. "It is time we heard from the one friend Agnes confided in." We found Miss Margaret Linton at her cottage half a mile beyond the edge of the Grange estate, a trim building nestled beneath the arms of a great yew tree. She received us with wary courtesy, her eyes shielded behind round spectacles, her sleeves rolled up from washing. Her face was composed, but there was a rawness to her voice when she spoke. "I suppose you're here about Agnes." Holmes inclined his head. "We would appreciate your perspective on the weeks leading up to her death." She exhaled. "I've spoken to the police, of course. They weren't terribly interested in what I had to say. They asked if I thought she might harm herself." "And did you?" I asked gently. She looked at me, lips pressed thin. "No, not Agnes. She may have been fragile at times, but she had a fierce will. Her sadness wasn't the type that collapses. It churned. She was trying to resist something." Holmes took out the book. "She kept this close, I believe." Margaret's eyes softened. "Yes, I gave it to her. She said the poetry was like someone whispering the things she was too afraid to say aloud." "You had a falling out?" Her jaw worked before she answered. "Not in the way people assume. I didn't abandon her, if that's what you're implying. Her father, he forbade me from visiting. Sent a letter telling me it was best if I stayed away, that I was only feeding delusions." "And what delusions were those?" Holmes asked quietly. Miss Linton stared into the hearth, where a cold fire lay dormant. That Agnes was being watched, that there was a pattern to the sounds in the walls, that her mother's death wasn't natural. She believed something had been hidden from her, something terrible. Holmes's expression sharpened. "Did she say what she suspected?" "She thought someone had betrayed her mother, and that her fate was being tied to it, like she was paying for a secret she never agreed to keep." "She wore a brooch," I said. "Silver, with curling said it was her mother's. Do you recall it?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, she said she only wore it when she needed courage. She was wearing it the day before she died," Holmes said, "but not when she was found." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Then someone took it." Silence fell. Holmes's voice was very calm. "Tell me, Miss Linton, do you know of anyone with the initial F? A name Agnes might have scrawled or spoken." The woman hesitated. "Once, she mentioned a name in a whisper. I thought she said Florin, but I could be wrong. It was late. She was frightened, kept looking over her shoulder." Holmes nodded. "That will suffice. Thank you for your time." As we departed, Margaret Linton placed a hand on my arm. "If you find out what happened to her," she said, "make sure they don't bury it in silence. She deserves to be heard." Back along the path to the Grange, Holmes walked faster, his pace purposeful. "The name Florin may prove crucial," he said, "but even more important is what it represents." Agnes was beginning to decode something hidden, not just memories, but identities. The brooch, the book, the mirror, each a portal to what was denied her. "What do we do now?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "We speak to the one person who has told us the least. The man who raised a daughter in isolation and buried a wife with unanswered questions." He turned toward the looming house. Mr. Vine must answer for the circles he drew. Chapter 10. The circle he drew. The drawing room of Hadfield Grange had grown colder, though no window was open and no draught stirred the heavy drapes. Mr. Vine sat by the fire as before, but his posture had altered subtly, no longer composed, but clenched. His hands rested on the arms of his chair like a man waiting for a storm to pass, or perhaps for a noose to tighten. Holmes did not sit. He remained standing in the center of the room, his coat buttoned, his shadow long across the faded rug. "Mr. Vine," he began, "you have been remarkably reserved regarding your daughter's last days. The portrait you painted of her was strikingly incomplete. Omitted were the delusions, the fear, the conviction that someone sought to harm her." Vine's mouth tightened. Those were fantasies, unfortunate symptoms of her condition. Holmes tilted his head. And what condition was that? The old man shifted. "Melancholia. She declined after her mother's passing. I did what I could." Holmes opened the book he had carried since that morning and held it up. "You forbade Miss Linton from seeing her, yet your daughter treasured this gift from her. One wonders what you feared might be passed along with the poetry." "I feared only for her stability," Vine said, eyes flickering. "She clung to illusions. I had to protect her from them." Holmes's tone did not waver, and from the truth there was a beat of silence, thick and drawn. The only sound was the creak of the firewood settling in the grate. Vine's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Holmes, I fail to see how any of this relates to her death." "Then permit me to clarify. Your daughter believed someone had betrayed her mother, that her death was unnatural, that someone or something was watching her. She wore her mother's brooch for protection, but when her body was found, it was missing." Vine's face twitched. "That brooch was meaningless. To her, it was not, nor, I suspect, to the person who took it. I told the constable everything I knew." Holmes stepped forward. "And yet you neglected to mention the name Florin." That struck something. Vine's fingers curled slightly on the chair arms. "I don't know the name." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "I think you do," Watson interjected quietly. "Agnes scrawled a single F on her mirror before she died. Perhaps that was a final accusation." Vine's face turned pale. He rose suddenly, the chair legs scraping the floor. "I will not be interrogated like a suspect." Holmes didn't move. "You're not a suspect, Mr. Vine. You are a wall between the truth and the light. But walls crack." There was silence, brittle and stretched. Then Vine exhaled, as though from a long-held breath. "My wife," he said softly, "had secrets. There were letters I never read until after her death. Strange ones, from someone named Florin, a man I had never heard of." "What was in them?" Holmes asked. "Nothing overt, but there was an intimacy, a language of code between them. I confronted her once, shortly before she passed. She denied an affair, said he was part of something before me, something she could never name." "Did you destroy the letters?" Vine hesitated. "I burned some. I kept one." He crossed to the writing desk and unlocked a narrow drawer, retrieving a sheet of yellowed paper folded into thirds. Holmes took it and unfolded it gently. The letter was briefed, just a few lines in looping hand. "I was a shadow when she met me. You gave her light. I would never steal it. But the ring remains. Hide it where it cannot close again." Holmes stared at the page. The ring, a circle, a brooch, or something else. "Agnes found this," Vine said, "6 months ago. I hadn't known it was in the desk. Afterward, she changed, grew withdrawn, obsessed." Watson looked up. "Did she ever speak of the brooch's origin?" "She said it belonged to her mother," Vine said, "but I never saw it until Agnes began wearing it. I assumed it was a keepsake." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Or a key." He turned to Vine once more. "You said you kept her world small, that you meant to protect her, but she was not safe, was she?" Vine's jaw clenched. "I did what I believed was right, but the past is not buried so easily," Holmes said, "and the shape of a secret is always circular. It turns back upon itself." Outside, the day was slipping toward twilight. Holmes stood beneath the porch's overhang, the letter clutched in his hand. "There's something still hidden," he murmured. "The brooch, the letter, the word ring. We're dancing around a symbol, not just an object. Perhaps it's both." "Do you believe this Florin exists?" I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. "I believe he did. Whether he lives still remains to be seen. But this much is clear: Agnes Vine died, not from solitude, nor madness, but from proximity to something older, a secret her mother tried to bury." He turned toward the eastern wing. where the dark windows of the attic rooms reflected the dying light. And if I am not mistaken, the last piece of that secret still lies in this house. Chapter 11. The Eastern Wing. The eastern wing of Hatfield Grange loomed in silence, its corridor draped in a stillness that felt heavier than dust. The house, which had once been whole and proud, now seemed fractured its halves, estranged like a face marred by an unseen scar. Holmes and I crossed the threshold with deliberate steps, our footfalls muffled on the worn Persian runner beneath. This part of the house was sealed after Mrs. Vine's death, Holmes noted, observing the tarnished brass latch and warped hinges of the first door we encountered. The servants claimed not to enter, and I believed them. I cast a glance at the high-arched windows where ivy had crept in from the outside, its tendrils frozen against the panes like skeletal hands. The air here had a stagnant, chalky taste, as if no breath had been drawn within these walls for years. Holmes paused at the end of the corridor, where a door, narrower than the others, stood ajar by half an inch. "The nursery," he murmured. "How do you know?" He pointed at the hand-painted illustrations still visible on the lower wall: dancing bears, ships with golden sails, and a tiny paper moon hung above the door like a charm. He pushed it open. The room beyond had not been touched by light for some time. Dust floated in the beam of Holmes's lantern like spores suspended in amber. The nursery's furniture, miniature chairs, a faded rocking horse, a shelf of neglected toys remained, arranged as if awaiting the return of a long-departed child. Yet the room held no warmth, only echo. Holmes moved to the window and pulled back the thick drapes. The daylight that entered was grey and reluctant. On the mantel sat a music box. Holmes wound it once, and a brittle melody began to play, a lullaby I could not name, sweet and fractured. Halfway through the second line, it faltered and stopped. He opened the lid. Inside lay a lock of hair, neatly tied with a red ribbon. I asked. "More likely her mother's," Holmes replied. Judging by the color, he pocketed the ribbon and turned his attention to the wall behind the cot. At first glance it was plain plaster, slightly cracked by time, but Holmes examined it closely with his lens. "There are marks here," he said, "faint impressions beneath the paint." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small vial of tincture, which he dabbed gently across the wall with his handkerchief. Slowly, like a ghost surfacing through fog, a circle began to emerge, drawn in faded ink, perhaps charcoal, the size of a dinner plate. In its center was a symbol, a hairpin, looped and inverted, piercing the circle's heart. I stepped closer, chilled despite myself. "It's the same symbol from Agnes's journal." Holmes nodded. "The circle that watches, the seal that binds." He traced the outer edge with his gloved finger. "This is no child's scribble. It was drawn with intent." We stood in silence, staring at the sign. It was crude and old, yet bore a strange weight, as though it still held the air captive in the room. The lullaby had ceased entirely, and now the only sound was the hush of wind pressing against the glass. "There's something else here," Holmes said suddenly. He knelt before the wall and knocked lightly, but hollow. He removed a small knife from his pocket and pried gently at the baseboard. It gave way with a splintering groan, revealing a narrow recess behind. Within lay a wooden box wrapped in yellowed linen. He pulled it free and unwrapped it slowly. The box was no larger than a book, fastened with a clasp of intricate brass. He opened it. Inside was the brooch. We both stared. It was unlike anything I had expected. Not merely a trinket, but a relic of old, darkened by age, with a circular design worked into its face. A tiny pin curled through the center like an eye. "The missing brooch," I said. Holmes turned it over in his hands. And yet, it was not missing. It was hidden. But why would Agnes hide it, then accuse someone of taking it? "Perhaps she didn't," Holmes murmured. "Perhaps someone else planted that conclusion. The brooch may have never left this room." But the constable claimed. "Her body bore a clear mark where it had once been pinned." Holmes nodded slowly. "So either someone removed it before she died, or after." He studied the interior of the box again. Beneath the brooch was a slip of paper. He unfolded it. One word was written, in the same curling script as the florin letter, "Ring." Holmes's jaw tightened. She was circling something. Watson, not just in her thoughts, but in her movements, her hiding places, even in the words she left behind. This symbol, this ring, whatever it signifies, it terrified her. I looked again at the mark on the wall. "You think it's a sigil?" "I think it's more than that," Holmes replied. "I think it was meant to seal something away." He straightened. "We must speak to Miss Linton again." She may know what the brooch meant to Agnes, and more importantly, what Agnes feared it might unleash. He tucked the brooch back into the linen and folded the paper carefully. As we left the nursery behind, I glanced over my shoulder at the ghostly circle, still visible on the wall. For the first time, I wondered if Agnes Vine had not died of madness or murder, but from touching something that should have been left buried. Chapter 12. What Agnes feared. Miss Linton received us in the library once again. Though her demeanour had changed, gone was the polished reserve. In its place was a taut unease that she made little effort to mask. Her eyes moved constantly toward the window, the door, the darkening corners of the room, as if expecting something to step from them at any moment. Holmes did not sit. He placed the small wooden box on the table between them, its linen wrapping carefully folded back. She stared at it. Her fingers twitched slightly. "You recognize it," Holmes said calmly. She gave no reply. "Miss Linton," he continued, "this brooch was concealed behind the nursery wall, wrapped, sealed, hidden with care. I believe Agnes placed it there deliberately and that it was central to whatever she feared in her final days." "What was it?" She took a long breath and folded her hands tightly in her lap. "It belonged to her mother," she said at last. "Mrs. Vine wore it every day until the end. She said it had been passed down through the women in her family since the time of Queen Anne. But it wasn't valuable, not in the usual sense. No gold, no jewels," I said, noting its dark, unassuming design. She shook her head. "It was always more symbolic." "Symbolic of what?" Miss Linton's voice dropped. "Of the circle. That's what Agnes called it. She never explained it fully, not to me, not to anyone. I think, but she believed it was more than just a family token, that it held something captive." Holmes's brow rose slightly. "And she feared it might one day fail in that function." She nodded, her voice trembling. "Agnes said the women in her line were guardians of it, that the brooch was a seal, that if it was lost, or broken, or placed wrongly, something could escape. She didn't name it, but she always used the same words. 'It watches,' she'd say, 'it waits for a circle to break.'" "And did you believe her?" Miss Linton hesitated. "At first, no. Agnes had always been imaginative, but near the end, her fear was real, not theatrical or hysterical, but bone deep. She started drawing those circles on paper, on the walls, even in the condensation on the windows. She would hum to herself for hours, and the brooch, she treated it like it was alive, like it needed to be put to sleep." "Was anyone else aware of this?" Holmes asked. "I don't know. Perhaps Miss Carmody. She was closest to Agnes. She mentioned nightmares." I offered. Miss Linton nodded. "Yes, and Agnes would wake screaming sometimes. She said the brooch had begun to whisper, that it wanted to be worn again." Holmes leaned forward. "Did anyone else wear it after Mrs. Vine's death?" Miss Linton's eyes darted to the brooch. "No, Agnes refused. She kept it locked away for years, but 2 weeks before her death, it vanished. I remember because she was beside herself, searching everywhere, accusing the staff, even me. Then suddenly, she stopped. She said it had gone to where it needed to be. I assumed she'd recovered it and hidden it, but not behind the wall. She feared what it symbolized," Holmes said, more to himself than us. "She feared that the symbol, once unmoored from its place, might enact what it stood for." I frowned. "But that's superstition." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, his gaze never leaving the brooch. "Or perhaps it is a logic older than science, one we no longer have the language to pass." Miss Linton stood. "If Agnes believed the brooch was dangerous, Mr. Holmes, then I suggest we do what she could not. Destroy it." Holmes raised a hand. "No, not yet. Destruction can be a trigger, not a solution. If it was sealed for a reason, we must first understand the terms of that seal." His eyes glinted, not with fear, but precision. "We must find the ring," he said softly. "Not the jewel nor the circle painted on walls. The ring Agnes referred to in her last note, the true one." Miss Linton looked between us, pale and silent. Holmes pocketed the brooch again and turned to me. "We must return to Agnes's room tonight, before anyone else moves to do so." As we left the library, a wind rose outside, moaning softly through the cracks in the Grange's old bones. I felt its chill along the nape of my neck and found myself echoing Miss Linton's words in my mind. "It watches." Chapter 13. The room beneath the floorboards, hallways of Greystone Grange, stretched long and quiet beneath the hush of nightfall. A thin mist clung to the windowpane, and every step Holmes and I took up the staircase, seemed muffled by something greater than silence and ancient stillness that had settled over the manor like a buried breath. Agnes Vine's bedroom had not changed since we last saw it, but in the dark it took on a different life. The fire had been extinguished, the curtains drawn, and the shadows cast by our lanterns seemed to linger too long in the corners. Holmes moved directly to the area where the brooch had been found behind the cracked plaster near the nursery wall. He knelt, tapping gently along the baseboards. Then to the floor itself. "Watson," he said in a low voice, "bring the lantern closer." I obliged, casting the light over the boards as Holmes ran his hand along a set of seams barely visible to the eye. With sudden precision, he pulled out a narrow blade and inserted it between two panels. There was a soft click, followed by a faint shift of wood. A section of the floor, perhaps 3 feet by 2, lifted upward at an angle, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. "A hidden space," I whispered. "But why here?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the glow. "Because this room was her sanctuary and her prison." He reached inside and drew out a cloth-bound bundle, yellowed and delicate. He unwrapped it carefully, layer by layer, until a stack of thin, handwritten pages came into view, each page marked in Agnes Vine's curling script. The first bore a title, in ink darker than the rest. The circle must not break. Holmes's lips tightened. Her journal, or something meant to be one. He began to leaf through the entries, eyes scanning rapidly, lips murmuring fragments. I watched the lines of his face change, not with alarm, but with a kind of sharpened concentration. "What does it say?" I asked. "She writes of dreams, repeating ones, of a woman in grey who waits at the edge of a stone circle, of whispers from a locked box and a hairpin that won't lie still. She speaks of the brooch not as an ornament, but as a ward, a seal to hold something named only as the other voice." "The other voice?" Holmes nodded slowly. "It seems she believed the brooch was a key to containment, that her ancestors, women of the Vine line, had passed it down, not for heritage, but duty." He turned to another page, brow furrowing. "Here she writes of a ring, not jewelry, but a physical ring of stones, a structure somewhere on the grounds. The ring must be watched, she writes. It draws breath only in silence. The brooch rests, but the ring listens." A chill ran up my spine. "She's talking about the old druidic circle behind the orchard." Holmes's gaze met mine. "Precisely. The locals call it the Grey Lady's Ring, do they not?" I nodded. "A collection of ancient stones long abandoned." Miss Carmody mentioned the name. Holmes stood, tucking the journal under his coat. "Then we must see it, tonight, before dawn wakes whatever memory sleeps beneath it." "But why the urgency?" He looked toward the open floor panel. "Because Agnes knew her time was short. Because someone else is now searching for what she sealed. And because, if I'm correct, the brooch is only one part of a broken lock." Before we could replace the floorboard, a faint knock echoed through the walls. We froze. It came again softer this time, not from the hallway, but from within the wall itself. A hollow, tapping rhythm. 1-2, 1-2-3. Tom signaled me to extinguish the lantern. We stood in darkness, ears straining. The knock repeated, slower now. Then it stopped altogether. We remained motionless for nearly a minute. When at last Holmes relit the lamp, the room appeared unchanged, save for a small detail I had missed before. Upon the frosted glass of the window, someone or something had drawn a perfect circle. Still wet, still fresh. We stared at it. Holmes's voice was very quiet. "It seems we are not alone in our interest, Watson." Chapter 14. The Grey Lady's Ring. It was not yet 4 o'clock when we set out from Greystone Grange, the night pressing in thick and cold. The moon had hidden itself behind a mantle of cloud, and only the weak lantern Holmes carried gave shape to the path as we crossed the orchard. A breeze stirred the branches, and in the hush of trees shedding their summer skins, even the wind seemed to whisper secrets to old foremen. We walked in silence. The only sound, the crunch of dead leaves beneath our feet. The journal pages burned in my mind, the repeated mentions of the ring, the voice, the brooch acting as a seal. I stole a glance at Holmes. His face was unreadable, but I knew that whatever lay ahead, he had already begun piecing together its geometry. At last, the trees parted. The ground ahead sloped into a natural basin, and there, almost imperceptibly against the darkness, stood a collection of time-worn stone stalls, their surfaces laced with moss and age. "The Grey Lady's Ring," Holmes murmured, stepping forward. The air within the circle felt colder. There was no breeze here, only stillness. The stones, about a dozen in all, were arranged in an imperfect circle, though several had toppled. One in particular, toward the far side, had split clean in half, as though by lightning or some pressure from within. Holmes moved to the center, his lantern casting a yellow halo across the ancient ground. "Note, the earth," he said softly, "scuffed, recently disturbed." He knelt and pointed. "Footprints, 2 sets, one small likely Miss Carmody's, the other, larger, a man's, heavy heel, narrow gait, and here see the drag, as though he were carrying something." I followed his gaze and saw the shallow furrow running across the soil, ending just before a stone that leaned slightly inward. Holmes examined the base of that stone, brushing aside some fallen leaves. Embedded just beside it was a hairpin, not the ornate brooch from Annis's room, but a simpler piece copper, tarnished by weather, yet unbent. Holmes held it up to the lantern. "This," he said, "was used for something far more deliberate than holding hair." He paused, listening. From somewhere to the north beyond, the circle of faint sound stirred. Not footsteps, nor wind, but something between the two. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly. We stood very still in the dark, hearts thudding. Then, faintly, the sound of something humming, a low vibration not from throat or machine, but from the very earth. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Holmes nodded slowly. "Subterranean, not natural." The sound ceased. Silence reclaimed the ring. Holmes relit the lantern and turned to the toppled stone again. With deliberate motion, he traced a finger along its face. "Look here. There are markings beneath the lichen, worn, but deliberate concentric circles, joined by a line and a smaller point at the center. A symbol, perhaps a map, or a mechanism." He knelt and began to clear the earth near the base. The soil came up looser than expected. Within minutes, he struck wood dot. We shared a glance. Holmes pressed gently. The panel beneath gave slightly, and then a narrow section lifted, revealing a hollow no deeper than a boot. Inside was a small iron box, its lid blackened, locked by a clasp shaped like a serpent eating its tail. Doton Ouroboros. Holmes held it up, a perfect metaphor for a sealed cycle. The lock opened with a quiet snap. Inside lay a handful of items, a folded paper, a second brooch smaller, identical in design to the first, and a faded photograph. Holmes unfolded the paper first. On it, only one sentence, written in Agnes Vine's unmistakable hand. "The second seal shall only hold if the voice forgets its name." Beneath that, in different handwriting, sharper, more recent, the circle broke once. "It must not again." We stared at it. Holmes's face was unusually grave. "And the photo?" I asked. He turned it toward me. It showed 2 women, both in white, one clearly Agnes Vine in her youth. The other woman wore the same brooch upon her chest, her hair drawn back with a plain copper pinther, same design as the one we'd just found near the stones. Holmes tapped the second figure. "That," he said, "is the missing name, the one the voice must not recall." The humming began again, stronger this time, not distant, but here, beneath our feet. Holmes dropped the box and stood. "We must go now." We left the ring in haste, the stones behind us seeming to lean inward, as if drawn by some growing gravity. Neither of us spoke until we were halfway back through the orchard, the lantern swaying with each hurried step. Finally, I asked, "What does it mean, Holmes? That voice, the ring, what is it trying to recall?" He glanced back once toward the rising mist. "A memory buried, a grief given shape, and if we are not swift, Watson, it may soon find its tongue." Chapter 15. The Voice That Forgets Nothing. We returned to Greystone Grange under a sky growing restless with storm. The breeze that had once whispered through the orchard now hissed against the window panes, as if the house itself had become a vessel for the winds of the past. Holmes moved swiftly through the entrance hall, lantern swinging in one hand, the iron box clutched in the other. I followed, my thoughts knotted by the cryptic inscriptions and that strange humming sound beneath the earth. In the drawing room, Holmes cleared the table and laid out the contents once more. The second brooch, the photograph, and the parchment bearing the 2 ominous sentences. He stood over them for several long moments in silence, his gaze scanning each object like a clockmaker peering into the cogs of a seized mechanism. I broke the silence first. "Holmes, what do you believe this voice truly is? A person, a symbol, or something else entirely?" Holmes gave a faint shake of his head. "Not a person in the ordinary sense. The phrasing, 'the voice must not recall its name,' suggests something buried deeply in identity. A shared memory, perhaps. A vow. He turned the photograph toward me again, tapping the brooch worn by the second woman, the unknown figure beside the youthful Agnes Vine. I believe this woman once bore the same role Agnes did, possibly a predecessor, and the fact that her image was hidden in a buried iron box suggests that remembering her is forbidden or dangerous. Could she have been the original bearer of the voice? Holmes glanced at me, eyes narrowing slightly. Perhaps, or perhaps, she was the voice. He reached for the second brooch, holding it against the firelight. Its pattern matched the first exactly, concentric rings engraved with faint, uneven etchings too faint for the naked eye. Holmes produced his magnifying lens and leaned in, his breath slowing. "Remarkable," he muttered. "What is it?" He handed me the lens and gestured. "These aren't merely decorative lines, they're characters, old ones some Latin, others earlier still. I can make out fragments of a phrase, Custos circle, a guardian of the circle." Suddenly, there came a knock. We both froze. It was not loud but deliberate. 3 knock spores, then 2. Holmes rose silently, crossing to the door and opening it a sliver. On the threshold stood Margaret Carmody, her pale face streaked with tears, her cloak sodden with night dew. I followed you," she stammered, "from a distance. Please forgive me. I had to know." Holmes stepped aside, allowing her in. She clutched a handkerchief, fingers trembling. I closed the door behind her as she collapsed onto a chair by the fire. "I saw you at the ring," she said. "I couldn't hear much, but I saw you uncover something. Please, I know there are things about Agnes no one ever told me, things they hid from me." Holmes studied her carefully. "Tell me, Miss Carmody, did Agnes ever mention a woman who wore a brooch like hers?" Margaret blinked, then slowly nodded. "Yes. Once I remember now. It was long ago, just after my mother died. I found Agnes in her bedroom, sitting by the hearth, holding an old photograph. She tucked it away quickly when she saw me. I asked who it was, and she said, someone who forgot what she was meant to forget." She looked up at us, fear trembling at the edge of her voice. "What does that mean?" Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Miss Carmody, I believe that the brooch your aunt warned, the circle of stones near the orchard, were part of an older tradition, perhaps even a ritual observance. The circle may have once served as a site of symbolic sealing of memories, identities, perhaps even knowledge that was deemed dangerous." Margaret paled. "You think Aunt Agnes was part of some cult?" "Not necessarily a cult," Holmes replied. "More likely, a guardianship, an inheritance of duty." The repeated references to silence, to memory, and to breaking the seal all point to an ancient tradition, passed from one woman to another. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "The night before she died, she stood in the hallway outside my room. I wasn't meant to see her. She held something in her hand, something round, and she was speaking to it, whispering. I only caught one word." "What was it?" Holmes asked softly. "Edith." The fire crackled. Holmes drew in a breath, the name settling into his mind like the final piece of a cipher. "Then that," he said, turning to the photograph, "is our missing name." He stood and moved toward the mantel, the shadows from the hearthlight dancing across his angular features. "We are approaching the center of the labyrinth. Watson," he murmured, "the voice is awakening, and the circle, once sealed, has begun to open." Chapter 16. The silence of Edith the Wind grew louder as midnight neared, as if the very earth braced itself for the revelation Holmes now pursued. Margaret had retired upstairs under Holmes's urging, though I could tell sleep would not claim her easily. Holmes and I remained in the drawing room, the fire now reduced to low embers and long shadows cast upon the walls. Holmes stood before the hearth, the photograph of the unknown woman Edith. If Margaret's memory served true balance between his fingers, he stared into the woman's eyes with an intensity that suggested he was searching beyond the image, beyond even the paper itself, into the ghost of the woman's life. "Watson," he said without turning, "do you recall the phrase on the parchment from the iron box? The voice must not recall its name, lest the circle be broken. The voice must not bleed, for the silence will not hold." "Precisely," he murmured. "The name Edith once spoken acts as a key, a trigger. That's why Agnes never spoke it aloud, and why it was buried with such care." "But what, precisely, would be unlocked by recalling it?" "That," Holmes said gravely, "is the remaining piece of the puzzle. But we are closer now, much closer." He laid the photo back down and retrieved the brooch, holding it to the low light. "I believe these artifacts are more than ceremonial tokens," he said. They may serve as a means of protection or control. Edith wore hers, as did Agnes. Perhaps to carry the voice is to bear the burden of something once confined, something that could return. You believe it to be a kind of possession? I asked, half scoffing, though not entirely without unease. Not in the spiritual sense, Holmes said, but perhaps in memory, or mind. A woman takes on the name of the voice, bears the burden, and in doing so, forgets who she was. He turned to me, his eyes dark and fixed. The most effective prison, Watson, is the one inside the mind. A sudden knock at the door startled us both. Holmes moved swiftly to the hall. When he returned, he carried a small parcel addressed in a hand I recognized at once. "It's from Mrs. Dansley," Holmes said, tearing it open. Inside lay a folded letter and a modest cloth-wrapped item. Holmes read the letter aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you asked me to notify you should anything unusual emerge from Miss Vine's effects. As fate would have it, her cousin discovered this tucked behind the frame of the kitchen hearth, a place no one had cleaned in years. It was wrapped carefully in waxed paper, bound by black ribbon. I dare not speculate on its contents. Yours respectfully, Anne Dansley." Holmes carefully unwrapped the cloth. Nestled within lay a hairpin identical in design to the one Agnes had worn, but this one bore an inscription along its stem, faintly etched, nearly invisible in the fire's light. He lifted it with reverence. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is not a common ornament. It was hidden, perhaps even ritually sealed. And look on the spine, just there. What do you see?" I leaned in, squinting under the lamplight. The words were nearly worn away. "Quieta non mover, Latin," I whispered. "Disturb not the quiet." Holmes gave a grim nod. This was not left behind by chance. He rose abruptly, gathering the brooch, the photograph, and now the hairpin, and wrapped them in a soft towel before slipping them into his coat. "We must return to the circle," he said. "In this storm, there's no time for comfort. The wind will serve to mask us and, I believe, whatever secrets remain." "Are there?" The wind clawed at our coats as we ventured once more into the orchard. The trees swayed like sentinels, their gnarled limbs twisting against the blackened sky. When we reached the ring of stones, Holmes did not hesitate. He knelt at the center, placing the brooch on one stone, the photograph on another. The hairpin he set precisely where the center line met the circumference, the place where he had first uncovered the box. "Now," he said, and looked to me. "Repeat the name aloud." "Edith," I said, unsure. Louder I did. "Edith," at once. Something shifted. The wind. Pauses just for a heartbeat. Then a groaner, low, subterranean crick echoed beneath our feet, and in the center of the circle, a thin crack began to split the earth. Holmes stood, expression unreadable. The wind resumed, fiercer now, but our eyes were locked on the slow, widening line in the soil. "It's not a grave," he said. "It's a door." Chapter 17. What lies below? The crack in the ground widened with a deep, reluctant groan, as though the earth itself resisted what was about to be unearthed. Holmes and I stood motionless. The objects he had placed, hairpin, brooch, photograph, now quivering slightly as if caught in a current not made by wind. Suddenly, the center of the circle gave way, revealing a narrow shaft carved of stone and packed soil. A faint scent of musty air drifted up from the opening, ancient, stale, but unmistakably human. Holmes knelt beside it without hesitation and held his lantern over the edge. The flame flickered wildly, caught by some updraft from below. "It was never meant to be found again," he murmured, "but someone wanted it left intact, preserved." I looked uneasily at the opening. "Do you intend to go down there, Holmes?" "Not alone," he replied, with a glance that told me the matter was settled. "Come, Watson, bring your revolver, and whatever courage remains in your physician's bones." I swallowed hard, drew the weapon from my coat, and followed. Holmes produced a length of rope from his bag and fixed it to one of the sturdy orchard trees. The descent was treacherous, narrow, cold, and slick with damp soil, but mercifully short. After 15 feet, we landed in a small underground chamber, its stone walls rough-hewn and slick with condensation. Holmes lit another lantern, and its glow revealed markings, circles, spirals, and ancient sigils etched along the walls in trembling hand. "A crypt of some kind," I whispered. "But why build it beneath the orchard?" "Because this isn't a crypt," Holmes replied. "It's a vault of memory, of identity. Look there." He pointed to a raised slab at the far end of the chamber. Upon it rested a decayed wooden box, not unlike the one Agnes had unearthed but larger. and bound in tarnished iron. Holmes stepped forward and knelt beside it. His fingers brushed over the surface reverently, then found the latch and pried it open. Inside were a dozen folded pages, brittle with age. Alongside them lay a hairpin identical to the others, this one blackened by time. Beneath it, something even more chilling, a faded white ribbon stained with what looked to be old blood. Holmes unfolded the first page and began to read aloud, voice quiet, to the one who bears the name, "You are the silence that holds the circle. You must not remember who you were, for the voice returns when the name is reclaimed. Edith was the first, I was the second, and if you read this, you may be the third." He paused, the lantern light catching the sharp edge of his profile. "Watson, these pages form a confession, not of a crime, but of sacrifice, of identity surrendered." I took another and read, "They thought me mad when I spoke of the woman in the orchard, but she came with the wind, and her eyes bore the storm. She said my name was hers now, and I was to take hers in return. When I refused, I woke in a circle, and the name Edith was stitched into my apron. I felt a chill climb my spine. Are you saying this has happened before? That women have been replaced, not replaced?" Holmes said. "Transformed, made vessels for something older, something passed through generations. The voice is not a ghost, it is a role, a mantle, perhaps even a curse." We examined the remaining pages in silence, each describing a different woman, each of them bearing the name Edith Vine, but none were the same person. Different birthplaces, different dates, but all tied to the same orchard, the same circle of stones. "It's not the woman who endures," Holmes said finally. "It's the name." I felt the weight of the earth pressing down upon us, more than just stone and soil, a burden of history, of something left to fester in darkness. Suddenly, we heard it, a soft, deliberate scraping above. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once. We held our breath as the faint shuffling grew closer. Then silence. Holmes motioned me to draw my revolver. We waited in darkness, the cold pressing against our skin. Minutes passed, then a whisper, too soft to make out, drifted through the shaft above. And then it was gone. Holmes relit the lantern. "Someone else knows," he said grimly. "Someone followed us. We should return," I said. "Before they seal us in." We climbed back up swiftly, the rope still secure. When we reached the surface, the wind had ceased entirely. The orchard stood in unnatural stillness, as though listening. The circle of stones remained untouched, but the photograph Holmes had placed now lay scorched and blackened, the face burned away entirely. Holmes stared at it with quiet intensity. "The name has been spoken again," he said, "and now, the silence is fraying." He turned to me. "Come, Watson, we must speak with Margaret once more before the voice finds her." Chapter 18. The voice in the orchard. There, clouds hung low over the village as we returned to the Vine estate, the afternoon light dimming unnaturally early. Holmes was silent for most of the journey, his expression fixed, as though listening to something beneath the wind. Margaret received us in the drawing room. She had changed from her pale house dress into a darker gown, and though her posture was composed, her eyes were shadowed and restless. "You've found it, haven't you?" she said before we spoke. "The place beneath the orchard." Holmes inclined his head. "I have, and I believe you know what it means." "I don't understand it," she said, shaking her head, "but I feel it. Something inside me, like a name whispered behind glass. When I try to remember the sound of my own voice, it slips away." Watson stepped forward gently. "Margaret, may I ask, when did you first begin to feel as though you weren't yourself?" She hesitated. "After the funeral, when they buried Edith, but I can't remember the burial. I only know I stood by the grave, and the hairpin was in my hand." Holmes moved closer, his tone low but firm. "Because it wasn't you who attended the funeral, Miss Vine, or not the you who was born in this house." Her face tightened. "You mean, I am her. You are the vessel for what remains of her," Holmes said. "Or perhaps, for something older. Edith Vine, as we have traced through that hidden vault, is a name passed from woman to woman, sometimes willingly, sometimes through coercion, but always bound to the orchard and its circle." Margaret's hand went to her temple, trembling. "So I'm not Margaret. I'm some echo." "No," Holmes said. "You are both. That is what makes you dangerous to the design. You have not forgotten your true self entirely, and that's why I tried to silence you. The voice, the one that haunts the orchard, it isn't a ghost, nor a person. It's a ritual perpetuated by belief, by names, by repetition. The hairpin, the brooch, The circle, they are anchors, symbols that reinforce the identity. But symbols can be broken. Margaret's eyes locked onto his. Then what do I do? Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the final hairpin, the one found in the vault, darkened with age. This is the original, the first, burned to sever its hold, but not destroyed. Take it to the circle. End the ritual. She stared at it for a moment, then nodded slowly. The orchard was even more still than before. The air hung heavy, as though time had thickened. Margaret stepped into the center of the circle alone, her hands gripping the blackened hairpin. Holmes and I remained at the edge, our breath visible in the unnatural cold. She knelt and, with slow deliberation, drove the pin into the earth. The moment it pierced the soil, a sound low, resonant, and terrible rippled through the trees, like a howl made of wind and memory. The stones around her shuddered. Leaves burst from the trees in sudden, violent spirals, forming whirls in the air. Then it came. A shape not quite human, not quite shadow rose from the edges of the circle, forming into a distorted figure of a woman. No eyes, no mouth, but unmistakably Edith's silhouette. Her dress billowed in an unseen current, and from her chest came a single, echoing whisper. Return. Margaret stood slowly. I will not, she said aloud. I remember who I am. I remember my mother, my home. My name is Margaret Vine. The voice screamed not with sound, but with force. The trees bent, the ground trembled, and the stones cracked. But the figure was already dissolving, melting into smoke that twisted upward into the branches, pulled higher and higher until nothing remained. The silence that followed was immense. The orchard returned to stillness. The circle was broken. The stones split. The hairpin smoldered softly in the soil. Margaret stepped back, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were clear. It's gone. Holmes nodded. You drove it out with memory, with will. That's more powerful than any ghost. She looked down at the broken circle. Will it come back? Holmes hesitated, then said, only if someone gives it a name again. We left the Vine estate that evening. Margaret watched us from the porch, her posture calm now, her hand no longer trembling. As we walked down the lane, I turned to Holmes. You truly believe it wasn't a ghost? Holmes smiled faintly. Not in the way you mean. Some spirits do not float or haunt but are born by ritual, secrecy, and the forgetting of names. This was such a spirit, and the women in the vault, not victims, not in the end. Each of them, in some way, chose to remain Edith Vine, chose to carry the silence rather than break it. Margaret was the first to resist. He lit his pipe, and we walked in silence a while before he added, there is danger in forgetting who you are, Watson, but greater danger still in allowing others to tell you. I nodded, and we passed the last of the orchard trees, where not a leaf stirred.